Welcome back to RIT Team Radio, where I'm joined again with Ryan Provencher of Firefighter Peak Performance, where we're covering part 3 of our flexibility and mobility series. Now, first part, we looked at just the overall impacts that flexibility and mobility had on the fire service. What does it really mean? We defined both of them, talked about what it means when applying it to the fire service. Part 2, we talked more about stats. We kind of honed in on the fact that there's an injury out there every 8 seconds, what that really means from a medical expense, and then a little bit more on the research side for overall effectiveness of different potential interventions and flexibility and mobility strategies. And now we're going to be talking about actionable items. We're going to be talking about things you can take away from this session and implement immediately. So welcome back to the podcast, Ryan. Glad to have you here for us to be able to talk about these actionable items and things that firefighters can start implementing into their day-to-day life.
Thanks, Hussien, and hello to everybody out there. I'm really excited about our topic today. I really like the idea of giving folks some things that they could do today to improve their mobility and or flexibility.
And in order to do that, we really want to hone in on and focus on these strategies you can implement. Starting the moment you get done with this podcast, you can start implementing them, or maybe you can go to a piece of paper and start writing down for tomorrow. Anyone uses paper still. Maybe you use notes in your phone or some kind of spreadsheet or something. But we're going to divide this into 2 different sections. One looking primarily at mobility. So recapping mobility is asking your body to go through these different movement patterns in a controlled fashion. And then flexibility is more of just investigating the range of motion, trying to improve the amount of motion you can go through. So, Ryan, first things first is we're kind of looking at a morning routine, right? We're trying to prep for the day. So if we're talking mobility strategies, what does the morning look like for you? And what are some things that people need to take in mind? What is the morning routine for? And what are things people can implement?
Yeah, so coming back to differentiating between mobility and flexibility, we talked about mobility being dynamic movements, active range of motion. And so what I really love to do in the morning, maybe have that first cup of coffee and then get right into a 15-minute mobility session, head to toe, joint by joint. And as I'm going through it, I'm really paying attention to, first of all, how does my range of motion feel in each joint? Am I noticing any limitations in any particular joint, any discomfort in any particular joint? And it's really a systematic process. And in the end, at the end of that morning routine, I've got just a little bit of sweat going, definitely feel my body's warmed up. Man, just a really great way to start the day.
Well, and like you said, being intentional, one, of what you're doing, but then also getting a feel for what you discover, right? Think of it as and what was interesting, and we'll reference this later down the road, is I went to a trigger point workshop. And one thing, and I know we probably mentioned this on another episode before, is when you're doing an assessment, and this can be a self-assessment, this can be just general motion, is there's a sense of discomfort or potentially pain, let's say discomfort, soreness. And in some cases with that restriction of motion, that's kind of like, let's say, a crime scene, and you heard a victim screaming, right? Like something happened. There's a crime. So you found the crime scene, right? Which is kind of either the soreness or maybe pain or discomfort. But in many cases, that's not the overall cause. It might be another joint and we've discussed in other episodes, where maybe joint by joint, something that needed to be stable is now mobile, and it's starting to cause discomfort in other areas. And so when you're moving around, the actual cause, which might be another muscle group, it might be a different area, that's the person that committed the crime. You don't go to the crime scene. Like, the person who committed the crime isn't chilling at the crime scene just waiting for you to show up. It might happen in other areas. And so that's where, like you said, be intentional, but also be aware when you're going through the motion, what feels uncomfortable, what feels maybe aches and pains. And then you're trying to figure out what are some other things or some other areas you might need to prioritize during that routine.
Yeah, and that's the beauty of going through that systematic approach. And that's, I like your analogy, and I've heard upstream and downstream from the discomfort area, all that good stuff. And once you have identified that, then you can maybe spend some more time really digging into it, where now you're bringing in maybe some soft tissue work or foam rolling upstream, downstream, just to make sure that that joint is optimized. And then the other thing that is important to note as you're discovering potential limitations, maybe you're really sore from an activity or a workout the day before, use that information to kind of map out your day. Be a little bit cautious about what you engage in if your body's not ready for it.
So does your morning routine, does it look like what you're going to do before you train, or is it specifically lower impact and providing you with that quality of movement in a general sense? How does that kind of differ between the morning routine for the 15 minutes and then getting into kind of the training mobility routine?
Yeah, so it really depends. Depends on what time I'm going to work out. So if I'm going to do if it's a moderate day or a strength day or a conditioning day, I will incorporate this morning routine as part of my warm up because I'm training, first thing in the morning. If I'm planning to train later in the day or in the afternoon, I'll still do just a comprehensive 15-minute head to toe morning routine as a standalone. And then that informs me again for what I would do later in the day. But either way, another great opportunity to go through this whole process is the warm up for the physical training that you have planned, whether it's your strength and conditioning around your movement patterns or what you've got set up. If you can really select dynamic movements that prime the movement patterns, and it, again, for all the same reasons. One, you get a sense of how your body feels in these patterns, and then you also are warming up and activating and preparing your body to do that work.
Well, and not to drift too far off topic, but when you are generally doing your mobility routine in the morning, and whether this is pre-shift or post-shift or maybe after an intense training session the day before, what are some potential problem areas or areas of concern for you? I know just in a general sense, granted, me not being in the fire service, mine might be a little different. There might be some similarities across just the general population as a whole. For me, it's usually sometimes hamstrings and sometimes just lower back and trying to get moving and get mobile. But what are some areas for morning routine? And we'll talk about exact examples and tasks later in the episode, but what are areas of concern or kind of those discomfort areas you've seen to kind of try and nitpick throughout the years?
Yeah, and you talked, I think in the last episode about, mobility and stability at different joints. And, here we're talking about a head to toe approach. So if I'm starting a mobility routine, I'm going through, even neck flexion and neck rotation. Sometimes if you sleep wrong or, you've heard the phrase, I've got a kink in my neck, like that'll present itself right out of the gate. And so, hey, maybe let me get on a lacrosse ball and let me kind of get that loosened up. And then the other thing we talked about last time that I think is super important for firefighters, we talked about thoracic mobility and how that impacts the lumbar spine. So if I'm incorporating, thoracic flexion and extension, or maybe thoracic rotation into my movement, my mobility, whether it's a warm up or a morning routine, is the check engine light going to come on? If I'm really don't have any flexion or extension, or if I'm really tight in rotation through my T-spine, boom, that's giving me information that I either do a deeper dive in working through that right away to set me up for the day, or it just makes me aware that, hey, I need to be aware of that, be cautious around that, either in my workout or in my firefighting for the day.
One, I like how you mentioned how you sleep, because it goes back to that like proactive versus reactive. And you're being in that morning routine, you're being reactive to how you slept, what position you slept in, right? And I like how you mentioned that, because I don't know about y'all, but I sleep and one arm's like under the pillow and around, and I'm hugging one pillow, and I have like 3 different pillows that I'm using. And so it's always the same arm. You realize you only get comfortable in the same position every night. And so it's always the same arm and same shoulder. I don't know if this happens to you, Ryan, or not, but that's just the personally for me. And so I really, that one shoulder, like I have to work mobility for it. And it's just because of how I slept, right? So we have to be aware of what are our body positions, sleeping the day before, when you're sitting, when you're driving, just those postures. And then, so how are we reactive to that? How do we kind of work our morning routine to be reactive in that sense, but then proactive for the day? So what does drifting over, so kind of the philosophy of the morning routine, what does prepping to move and prepping to perform look like? What is the reason for the dynamic warm up? And kind of what are some objectives for actually implementing it prior to training?
Yeah, so if we're still talking about a warm up or even our morning session, there's a couple ways to approach it to achieve a similar result. So if we're looking at a lunge movement pattern, for example, and to me, just doing a simple leg swing forward and back, leg swing inside, outside, figure eights with your foot, that's all kind of low back, hip. You're really getting a sense of how's your range of motion feel? Do I feel tight through the low back and hips here? Even getting a little bit of the knee joint in that. To me, that's just joint range of motion versus, and you could do in addition to a forward lunge with a reach across, or a backward lunge with a reach up and over. And now you're bringing in the movement pattern. It's unloaded, but your focus is to again, get a feel for the movement before you load it, and then to intentionally kind of activate and prime that movement for when you do load it in your workout. And we'll talk about that, I think, here at the end relative to a specific workout.
When you're trying to, one, prep your body to move at that higher level for the warm up to a training session, right? You're even slowly raising the intensity. It needs to be progressive in nature. You don't walk in and you do a warm up task that is super complex, higher intensity, incorporates, many or as many muscle groups as possible, right? It's very progressive in nature. You start very minimal, very low impact, and you progress in sequence to get to that point of now. And you mentioned building up a sweat, not that first task. You should be drenched in sweat and you should be, right, very, very impact. It should be low impact, building up to a little bit more higher in intensity the closer you get to your training session. But then also from and we'll talk about later the differences more of mobility versus flexibility, but you're trying to prep your muscles to contract and move and be forceful and generate power. It's not doing these tasks to relax your body. It's prepping to move. It's prepping to perform.
And when you think about a warm up, could you just walk on a treadmill for 5 minutes and increase your heart rate and feel warmer in general? Yes. Is that in my opinion, the most effective way to actually prime your body for the specific movements that you have planned in your training? I would argue no. You could certainly incorporate that in at the very beginning. Again, we talk about progressive. You could do a 5-minute walk on the treadmill. You could do 5 to 10 minute just joint range of motion, dynamic joint range of motion, and then follow that up with just maybe 5 movements to activate the movement patterns that you're planning. Boom, now you've got a very comprehensive warm-up that is progressive in nature and you're confident that it's preparing you for the work that you're about to do.
Well, and to give you kind of a simplified format in kind of the time differences between the two, NSCA's recommendation for a warm-up is having about a 10-minute, maybe 5 to 10 minute of a very general sense warm-up. This could be a jog, a walk. This could be something very low impact. You might go grab a jump rope. Don't know how many of you know how to jump rope, but maybe you go grab a jump rope or something, right? And it's very general. You're just you're moving around and raising your heart rate. But then the other side of that prescription or recommendation is about a 10, maybe 15-minute, very specific and targeted mobility routine. That doesn't mean isolating joints, but it doesn't mean you're performing tasks that are very, very high impact. You're still progressing. There's still progression, but you're trying to be a little bit more specific. Like you mentioned, what are the movement patterns? What are you trying to incorporate into the training session? How do we prep our body for those movement patterns?
Yeah, absolutely.
So now that we've kind of looked at the differences between the two and think of morning, just kind of prepping for the day, being proactive and reactive, and then dynamic warm up, really trying to prep our body for the movement patterns specifically to the training session, but also trying to prep those muscles to contract at whatever force or whatever you're trying to produce in the training session. You don't want to do something so low impact and then turn around your first exercise is very high intensity, incorporating a lot of muscle groups at a very rapid pace without prepping and priming for that. But what does that look like from a programming sense? Let's get into intentional or strategic scheduling. Let's kind of navigate it with that phrase, right? What does it look like incorporating it in a general sense, just kind of principles to incorporate? What does it mean to include these into your training schedule for the week?
Well, when we talk about designing or programming physical training programs for firefighters, I believe that periodized physical training is the most effective, and not to get dogmatic about it or to really it has to be a certain thing. But the way I look at it is that the physical training is programmed in such a way that there's structure while also providing flexibility that accounts for the stress of firefighting and shift work. So, for example, if I'm on shift one day, if I'm choosing to work out on shift, that's great, but I'm going to build in somewhere in that work cycle. And for me, I work 1 on 2 off, 1 on 4 off. So it's an 8-day cycle. And I build my physical training around an 8-day cycle. And so I've got 2 or 3 mobility days built into that. And I've got 2 or 3 flexibility days built in that to support my strength training days and my high intensity conditioning days.
So you have programmed out, kind of strategically placing within your training week where you're training, whether it's high impact days or high intensity days, moderate, low intensity days, but then very strategically knowing, okay, based on this, let's say high intensity day or kind of the accumulation of strain of the past couple of days, for a fact you're going to incorporate the mobility training or the active recovery day that session. Do you kind of have sessions in the bank, or let's say, depending on how you feel that morning, let's use the morning routine as the self-assessment and go, okay, instead of a high intensity day, I need to do a lower impact day. I need to do a lower intensity day. And then do you do maybe the same mobility routine that you have programmed for a different day? Or do you use that morning routine and go, okay, maybe this bank of tasks I have because of how I'm feeling, let's incorporate this. I guess another word of what I'm asking is, do you only follow the schedule you have, or do you try and modify on the fly depending on that morning assessment, and then maybe even the mobility routine prior to training?
Yeah, and that's where, being intuitive and intentional really comes in here. So if I had a busy shift or a higher intensity shift, or I had a strength training day or conditioning day, and I know that I'm due or ready for a mobility day, it's a dedicated mobility day in my 8-day training cycle. Today I'm focusing on mobility. So again, we're bringing in all of the same approaches and strategies in a more drawn out fashion. So you might go through and do all the same head to toe joint exercises to get a sense of how your body's feeling. You dig into now the more movement patterns or dynamic movement patterns that are unloaded and very low intensity. And then if you find something, if you find that crime scene, or if you're looking at an area for whatever reason, it just needs more work, then you can bring in some soft tissue work, maybe do some foam rolling, do some targeted mobility in that area. And every day you're training, you're really being intentional about how your body feels, and you're being proactive in mitigating that.
Well, I want to add and a little bit. You and I haven't really discussed this as much because we haven't talked as much into myofascial release or foam rolling, right? Which is myofascial release. And this is gathering a little bit from the trigger point workshop that I went to, and it was all foam rolling, right? Like we had the trigger point ball, and it was prescriptive in nature what we were doing. And the most general recommendation or prescription, I would say, with foam rolling, without getting too deep into the weeds with this, is thinking about larger muscle groups, dividing them in half. So let's say you're working the front of your leg, you're working your quads. You might divide that into upper thigh and lower thigh on the front side. And the thought process is to run at least 4 sweeps or 4 rolls back and forth, right? Like you'll roll down and up. That's one. And you'll do that 4 times. And then you will find whatever, you'll kind of work your way around. And there's always that one spot, right? Where like, it's a little bit uncomfortable because it's that really tight pressure point and it's going to relieve the most tension. There's always that, especially hip flexors, IT bands, you're going to find all the knots in there. But there's always that one in certain muscle groups and you pin it, right? So you'll put a lot of pressure there and then you'll go through flexion and extension of the nearest limb. For instance, you might pin your quad on a certain point and you'll bend your knee, you'll bend your leg at the knee joint a couple of times. And you'll feel, because you pin the muscle as you're starting to bend your leg and your foot is going closer to your hamstring, right? You're starting to bend your knee. You're going to feel a stretch just from pinning that point. So it was interesting. We worked through this workshop. We would roll and we would pin our tricep and we would go bending our elbow. We would pin on our scapula and we would, or on our shoulder blades around our scapula. And so we would pin a muscle group and then we'd go through different shoulder movements. And it was just a very interesting and unique experience, to say the least.
Yeah, and that's the beauty of it, is if you have a plan that incorporates all of this into it on a regular basis, think of it like taking out the trash. If you take out the trash once a month, it's gonna pack up everywhere. But if you take out the trash once a day, or every other day, there's just less trash to take out. So you're managing it. And then the other thing I would add, we know that cardio is important for firefighters. So this is another area where you could just do some light cardio, not anything that competes with your recovery, but again, just light work in support of this whole idea of either recovering from the training or work that you've done, or priming for work that lies ahead. And that's another, again, these things just kind of fall in this box of low intensity training, focused mobility, being intentional about your recovery and your performance.
So drifting from mobility, going over toward the flexibility side, and again, knowing the difference, think mobility is that desired, requiring your body to go through this controlled motion on demand. You're asking your body to do this. And flexibility is more of just general range of motion. We just want to increase how much we can move, in a sense. And so how does that differ? When would we incorporate that into our day? And then how does that routine differ from something we would do specifically looking at the mobility and the preparatory side of things?
Yeah, and so we talked, kind of differentiated between mobility and flexibility, and I know there's a lot of discussion out there about when do you do static stretching? Should you do it before your workout or after? And I feel like if we're differentiating between mobility and flexibility, and you and I just spent a lot of time covering the mobility side of it, now we get to talk about flexibility. We can talk about static stretching. We can talk about PNF and other strategies to release tension in the muscle, to lengthen the muscle, to identify what end range is for any particular joint and working with that. And again, to me, it's the same. So instead of a morning routine where you're really ramping up for your day, I really love an evening routine that helps you wind down from your day. Man, what feels better than just 10, 15 minutes of just light stretching, either before dinner, after dinner, before you go to bed, just as an intentional way to wind down from either your training specifically or just the stress of the day.
One, I want to add a little bit behind kind of the reasoning, right? Why you might include static stretching. Because again, that's the number one. I get to ask all the time too. When do and they don't word it as static stretching. First, it's like, when do I stretch? And you kind of mentioned right before, like you get moving. They're like, no. Where do I do the stretches where I just like hold a position and I just kind of stretch that? You might see people reach their arm across and grab their elbow and stretch, the back of their shoulder, their tricep. They might do, grab their leg and stretch their quad, whatever it might be. And the thought process is, and the reasoning you won't do as much, hopefully you won't do as much static before training, is static stretching, because you're holding in those in that range or at that end position for about 15 to 60 seconds and really getting a good stretch. It's meant for increasing range of motion, but it is actually going to have a reduction of strength output if you're trying to do a session right after it. Think of it, you're trying to increase that range, but it's not prepping to perform. You're not, so they should be two different sessions. Don't think we're trying to ramp ram flexibility and mobility and resistance training, all of it into the same session. Realistically, and we'll talk about in a second cool downs, but it should be dissected and thought of as different components. I also want to add for general pop, which in a preferred state, you would do this daily. But for those that maybe you haven't started, maybe we haven't convinced you to start doing resistance training yet. Maybe you haven't started a routine, that just the flexibility routine in itself for the general population, the recommendation is 2 to 3 days per week, just for general health. That's not even taking into account the impact of your job. It's not taking into the account the impact of your resistance training. This is just for general health. You should be doing flexibility at least, let's say, 3 times per week. So what does that mean? And we'll get into a little bit more of prescription in a general sense and where to incorporate it, cool downs and so forth. But if the general pop should be doing it 3 days a week, how does that kind of differ? What does that mean to you, Ryan, as a firefighter, and what you go through within your profession?
Yeah, and that's where I just really love the idea of, for one, really being intentional about what you're trying to do or the adaptation you're looking for. So if we're talking about mobility, that's one thing. If we're talking about strength, that's its own thing. If we're talking about conditioning or aerobic capacity, that's its own thing. And then over here, flexibility, right? So we're separating those out, and then we're being intentional in our programming and our periodization in how we bring those things in. And we're covering all of it in a way that's manageable for each individual, and that could be different. And that's where these suggestions come in. So if we're talking about flexibility, just an evening routine every night, hopefully, or certainly maybe off shift, or just whatever works best for you. Certainly at least that 3 days a week you're mentioning, just that 10 or 15 minute stretching routine.
Minimum, right? 3 days per week minimum.
Find where you need it. If you find areas that are tighter than others, spend more time there. That's where that intentional training comes in. Again, taking out the trash. If you're doing that unloading, that intentional release of tension, unpacking the harder work you've done earlier in the day or earlier in the week, there's just less to do next time. You're staying on top of it, so to speak.
So now let's say we kind of incorporate this into post-training. Let's say we're drifting into the cool down perspective. We did our mobility, our movement, primers. We got our body ready to go. We did a hard training session. And now we're incorporating this thing. And I mentioned before, right? Like cool downs to some people might be grabbing their gym bag and walking out. That's my cool down on my way to my car. Or maybe it's racking the equipment. That's my cool down. But what does the cool down mean to you? And how do we incorporate some kind of flexibility routine? And then what can you be doing while you're doing the routine to add value to what you're doing?
Yeah. So, in the same way that you ramp up for your workout, consider ramping down post-workout. So there's lots of different ways to do it, but if you're doing some sort of interval training or strength training, even just walking on the treadmill just for a couple minutes, just to let your heart rate come down, let your body cool down. If you're feeling tight in particular areas, maybe you do bring in some soft tissue work post-workout, as we were mentioning, and then certainly getting into some of these poses that are specific to unload the work that you've done. So we were talking about the lunge and some different ways to prime and prepare for that movement pattern. Well, if we get into maybe a pigeon or a modified pigeon to really unload that posterior hip, the glute, a little bit of the hamstring, and then we're also bringing in a kneeling quad stretch where we're opening up the hip flexor and the quad. Those two movements really do a great job of unloading the lunge, for example. And when you walk out of the gym, you should feel I feel kind of light through my hips and legs instead of just being so stiff and tight.
Well, and probably the number one modified pigeon pose, modified pigeon is definitely one that's out there to help with your hips and just the impact in the lower back and the hips and glutes and so forth. The next one, kind of the more common one that I've probably implemented with others, but kind of I would say not necessarily the most amount of noise, but when you have a group go through something and everyone's like, right? They all do that sigh like together, and you're like, and you knew it was going to happen because it's that one pose where everyone's going to feel the relief from it. But doing child's pose, right? Like drifting your hips back and going into child's pose is like probably the number one thing where just everyone kind of gets this sense of relief. And it's a very comfortable and relaxing posture and position to be able to get into. So thinking more of those to get into the relaxation / the recovery mentality to things.
Absolutely. And then bringing in a breathing technique into that also further facilitates that relaxation. So mindful of breathing, maybe you're breathing in 5 seconds and out 7 seconds, or just something that really kind of ties your intention and your breath to these positions you're holding can really go a long way in further facilitating that relaxation.
So we talked about mobility. We talked about being a primer for the day, but then a primer for your workout. We talked about kind of the mentality and the objectives behind it, and then talked a little bit more about flexibility. Dove a little bit into the purpose behind it, maybe some examples of tasks you can do. Let's kind of piece those together, right? What does, and starting with the workout aspect and kind of a sample of how to integrate it into a workout, what might be a sample routine or primer you could incorporate today prior to training?
Yeah, and so just kind of to put a bow on the flexibility section, again, having a whole day dedicated to flexibility. Maybe you're doing yoga that day, and that's your workout for the day. And again, you're putting all the pieces together. So if we're kind of now putting it all together in terms of mobility and flexibility and how that fits into the big picture of our training or our programming, here's a sample workout I want to throw out there for listeners. Give this a try. So the training protocol is 20 seconds work, 10 seconds rest for 4 exercises. And you're going to do 8 rounds for each exercise, 4 minutes per round. The 4 exercises are weighted walking lunge, which is the lunge movement pattern, kettlebell press, 1 arm, which is a vertical press, the med ball slam, which there's a pulling element, but primarily a hip hinge, and then a split stance row, where really we're looking to the horizontal row is the primary movement pattern there. So we know we've got 4 different movement patterns. So let's build a head to toe joint mobility, dynamic movement circuit that primes for that. And we're going to do each of these exercises for 1 minute. So the shoulder rotation, you're standing up tall, your arms are extended, you're rotating backward, each arm in an alternate fashion for 1 minute, and then you alternate forward, each arm for 1 minute. Dynamic arm pull is just switching arms, almost like Superman ripping his shirt. That's activating posterior shoulder. We talked about T-spine flexion extension is just a great way to prime for a hip hinge. And then I call it knee to chest, heel to glute. It's almost like kickstarting your motorcycle. Your knee comes up to your chest, you kick back, and you're just getting that circular motion through the hips and legs. So we've got your training session and your warm up up to this point. How does that land for you?
I like how you provided verbal cues, like you've explained these before, right? Where you say you're kick-starting and like you're ripping your shirt off, right? Because it provides you with cues of, okay, now I know what you're talking about. Even just verbally, right? You can kind of get a sense of what it might be. Even off of that, and I know it's kind of skipping ahead a little bit, but for those that go, okay, still, I really don't know what those names are. Maybe I want to see how to do those. What's a good resource for them to reach out to, or to even be able to see what these tasks are?
So, as you know, I've been working on a simple tools series for Fire Station Gyms with Crackle Magazine, a kettlebell, sandbag, med ball, TRX. The whole idea with the whole series is just to introduce folks to these concepts using very basic and simple tools. And so this is the approach that I've used in putting together not only each of the moderate and high intensity workouts, but also each of the standalone training days that cover what we're talking about. And even coming back to this particular workout, I want to make sure we don't miss the cool down, which is to me that we talked about the modified pigeon and the kneeling quad for unloading the lunge. I feel like the floor scorpion, where you're laying face down, kicking that leg back and over, you're really opening up through the chest and shoulders. And then downward facing dog really does a great job of unloading that whole posterior chain. So just coming back to planning this workout, we've covered our dynamic warm-up specific for the training session. We've planned our comprehensive cool down to unload the training that we've done. And then as I'm sharing with you, I've certainly used these strategies to build these simple workouts in association with Crackle Magazine.
One, I like just to hone in on this workout, right? This being an example workout, the fact that you mentioned going off of movement patterns, not saying we're doing this because we're training biceps. We're doing this because we're training traps. We're doing this because we're training quads, right? We are selecting very strategically choosing an exercise because of the movement pattern it's associated to, but then even taking a step further and saying to prep for that, we need to also integrate tasks and mobility tasks and primers that prep us for the movement pattern. So when we start adding load, we start going to more of those work tasks that we're prepped and ready to go. So now that we have, let's say that's an individual workout, what does a week look like? And the routines or the actual workouts in themselves per day might look different, right? There's plenty of other things you can incorporate from day to day. From a general sense, how do you potentially schedule out specifically flexibility days or specifically mobility days or when you train?
Yeah. So I made reference to an 8-day training cycle around my shift work. So if I'm on shift today, I'm going to do a mobility session this morning, like we talked about. Coming off shift, I'm going to just have a lower light flexibility day. By day 3, I'm ready for a strength day, and I'm going to do this workout that I just described to you at moderate intensity. I'm not putting the pedal to the metal. I'm doing it at a moderate. I'm getting a feel for the exercises. I'm working, but I'm not crushing myself. I'm on shift that next day, mobility day. I'm off shift, flexibility. I could add another strength day and do something. I would have a different program for the strength tray for the second strength day, mobility, and then the final day in the cycle is high intensity training. Now I'm going to do this same workout that I've prepped and primed for all week. I've practiced at least once, if not twice, in my lower or my moderate intensity training day, and now I'm confident that I can go all out, perform at my highest level, and not get hurt doing it.
Well, and I also want to reiterate that this schedule works for you, right? This routine works for your schedule. It works for, you're aware of the other, let's say, responsibilities and obligations you have, and that this schedule in itself works great as a good sample and a template. But anyone that's wanting to train also take into account all the other things that are unique to you as an individual. And this goes for any program, right? As we talk about programs, as we talk about tasks, it's still understanding you might have a different shift schedule. You might have OT, you might have another job, you might have other obligations, responsibilities. Like, you have to be strategic for you. But this being a very good sample routine and a sample schedule for those that might want to start, and maybe this works for you, that you can incorporate something into your week.
Absolutely. There's so many right ways to do it. And you and I will never say this is the only way or the right way or any dogma. We'll throw out suggestions, and folks, you can really modify this in so many ways to meet your own goals and to address the needs that you have personally.
Now, as we talk about flexibility and mobility, we talk about recommendations and guidelines out there. Know that the NSCA, the National Strength and Conditioning Association, has just different recommendations, different suggestions for incorporating this into our training, making sure we have our 10 minutes of very generalized prep and then 10 minutes of very specific prep prior to training, knowing just potentially the conflict of incorporating static stretching immediately prior to training. So hone in on the dynamic nature, the dynamic stretching or dynamic more mobility tasks prior to training, and just utilize them as a resource, utilize them as a guide for incorporating these into your daily schedule. I also want to again highlight the Simple Tools series that you have. I know we brought it up, we've talked about before we even have one of our podcast episodes is Simple Tools, right? And just talking about these very very versatile, unique ways, right? Some of them incredibly simple, right? That's the concept of the series, but just these principles and strategies to incorporate into your day-to-day life within your agency, at home, to be able to work on your health and wellness. So with that, and we'll tag it in all our other references, but for those that are listening, and again, I'll mention it in the description, where would they find your simple tools series?
You can go to my website is firefighterpeakperformance.com, or the fitness and wellness platform is firefighterpeakperformance.teachable.com.
Well, and to add to that too, and I'm trying to figure out where I'm going to display this. I think I'm going to do a sub page and make it, because my website being JabaiPerformanceTactical.com, I might just add a page where it's then /TAC10. But I have a program, a movement prep program called TAC10. I've actually just utilized it in a way where I go and work with agencies. And when we're talking about flexibility and mobility, the question is, okay, well, what should I do? And so I just threw together these 10 different flows, these 10 different tasks, where if you're going to do anything, here's something you can follow. And we've seen, I've seen just with the research we've done, because we've done mobility research for 8-week strength and conditioning programs and so forth, where I just incorporated that in. And it was a great way to get everyone moving and get started and have incredible feedback behind it. But realistically, I've kind of picked and chosen tasks that you're familiar with. And we mentioned child's pose. One of the flows is literally child's pose into Sphinx, or you could go into Cobra, and you're just going back and forth. You're like stretching your hip flexors into your core, and then you're going back and stretching more your posterior chain. It's just this constant flow. And that's one of the tasks. So it's not like it's a complete secret where I completely created tasks out of nowhere, but it's just giving you, if you don't do anything and and you need a great start, just a list of 10 things you can do. That's where I kind of formulated the TAC10 side of things. So I'll find a way. I'll put it in the description. It'll probably be a sub page to my website, but it's just a resource for you for a movement prep routine. But even with that, it's not the do all end all. We said there's no one right way to do things. There's plenty of resources, plenty of references and things you can incorporate into your day and into your weekly routine. So Ryan, any other resources, any other references or places individuals can look for guidance or for advice?
Yeah. And as I mentioned before, I've struggled with mobility and flexibility my whole life. And I've been very proactive in seeking out resources to just help me with that. And I've found quite a few that have helped me in different ways and that I highly recommend for anyone out there that's interested in doing a deeper dive on this. So Gold Medal Bodies is the first one that comes to mind. GMB, there's a physical therapist on the team over there. There's a coach that's been in the business for probably 30 years, very knowledgeable, and they provide all sorts of different options for mobility, flexibility, and they present it in a way that's fun and can be built into everything we've talked about in the ways that we've talked about. Many of you probably have heard of Kelly Starrett, formerly of Mobility WOD. His new company is called The Ready State. He takes a very intentional and systematic approach to mobility, flexibility. One I've discovered just this year is called Kin Stretch, and it's targeted joint strengthening using functional range conditioning principles. Really enjoying that, and I see a lot of benefit and value for firefighters. GoWOD has an app that does everything we've talked about. They've got a pre-workout option, they've got a post-workout option, they've got a daily routine option, all in the palm of your hand. That's a really efficient way to go. And last but not least, Precision Movement. Eric Wong is the founder of Precision Movement. He's a physical therapist, and again, has these periodized programs that are intentional about addressing mobility and flexibility.
Man, with that list of resources and then everything we've talked about, I don't see why someone who's listened through the whole episode, why someone would say, well, flexibility and mobility, how do I get started? Right. Right. To recap, we talked about your morning routine, right? Your 15 minutes of being intentional and prepping for the day. We talked about your time priming your body, prepping your body to perform, doing your dynamic movements before you train. We talked about your cool downs. We talked about incorporating stuff to release and relieve the tension and to ramp down from your training session. We talked about flexibility, trying to incorporate throughout our week and understanding that flexibility session in itself should be focused on flexibility, right? When you're incorporating mobility and you're incorporating more dynamic sense, that's very strategic for performance or for your day. But static or thinking flexibility should be intentional of just think quality in a sense of range of motion. You're just trying to improve your flexibility and should be a very targeted, very flexibility oriented session. It's kind of divvied out to itself. We also talked about kind of some scheduling, how we can manipulate where we're implementing mobility, where we're implementing flexibility, and how we can arrange it around our shift schedule. So we've kind of done it all, right? The first one was, what does it mean to the fire service? The second one was just and it was the surface level, right? There's just very surface level on the research side of things, what the research says for flexibility, mobility. But then we gave you actionable items, right? We gave you resources. We gave you suggestions of getting started. So hopefully this series helped you get started in a sense, at least for flexibility and mobility. We have some interesting topics coming up, and we want to make this an ongoing thing where we can give you more concepts about whether it's resistance training, cardiovascular training, different concepts, different principles. That way you can take on and be in control of your own health and fitness. So I appreciate it, Ryan, for you joining us here on the podcast. Hopefully y'all have learned something throughout this 3-part series of flexibility and mobility. And if you have any other suggestions, if there's things that you want to learn about, there's things you want us to talk about and really bring to the table so you can learn more and apply it to your day-to-day, feel free to reach out to us and be on the look for our next topic.